Moms and dads, thank you so much for joining us again for another episode of our First Family Today conversations. And today I am joined by a good friend of mine, someone who probably is in the top two people responsible for me getting my master's degree. I'm not sure she knows that, but she probably does, at the amount of time she had to spend with making sure that I was taking the right classes and just helping me get through it after quite a few years. We won't mention how many years it actually took me taking one class at a time to get my master's from Dallas Baptist University. But today we have Dr. Shelly Melia with us, and I am super excited about what she's going to talk about. But before we get to that, let me tell you about who she is. She's the Associate Dean of the Graduate School of Ministry, one of the Associate Deans there, and then she's also Program Director and Professor for the Preschool and Children's Ministry program there. And so I not only had her as an advisor and helping me get through, but also as a professor in classes. So Dr. Melia, Shelly, thank you so much for coming and joining with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I like to think of it that you took the scenic route, David. You know, you didn't rush. You enjoyed the view, and you were a great student. So
it was a very scenic route. I had to do it, but anyway, thank you so much for your help with that. And I love DBU from the day I walked on the property at a children's pastor's metro. I just really enjoyed it. And if anybody out there is looking for a college in the future, I know right now everything's up in the air, but a college that has the foundation of Scripture as being the foundational principle of education. Look at DBU, and not only their ministry degrees, but they have quite a few other things out there too that are really, really good. So today, though, I want to get us started in our conversation because I'm excited about this because you are a teacher. This is something that you do and you do so well. And so today's conversation is going to be a little bit different. We're going to have you share with us about our kids. And I think as parents, that's something that we're all concerned about. For the first couple of weeks, this is kind of like a weird summer vacation, but we still have to do some school. But now as this is wearing on and we're getting news now that our children are not going to go back to school at all this year, so they had to shut things down. It gets us worried about our children and how are they going to react? Are they going to be okay? And so the word that you and I were talking about was resilience. And so if you would today help us to understand about the resilience, and are our kids going to be okay in this?
Sure. I'd love to talk about that. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. And I think as a faith community, we're sort of in a unique position to help our kids be resilient. And so I'm going to share my screen with you and just share a presentation that may be helpful as parents think about helping their kids be resilient. Because that's the goal, right? Our kids are going to have times, and this is certainly one of them, where things are hard. And I like what you mentioned, because I think it is true, David, that at first it was kind of like a snow day or a nice little break, and we all kind of enjoyed it. And then I think as it's sort of gone on, it's gotten harder for parents. It's gotten more difficult, and maybe our concerns have even been raised. So I'm going to answer kind of two questions today, I hope. First of all, what can I do as a parent to help my kids be resilient? And then towards the end, just a little bit about why is this so hard? For some of our parents, maybe it's been very natural, and they're able to sort of adapt and cope pretty well. But for other parents, we know that it's been really hard. And so I'm going to talk about why that is the case and kind of give some ideas for that as well. When we think about resilience, though, there's a lot of literature out there. It's actually kind of a new topic, but it has to do with how do we help our kids bounce back after difficult times. We know based on John 16:33 that in this world we'll have trouble. And so it's a given that our kids are going to have trouble, but we have faith and hope that God has overcome the world. And so when you look at literature that talks about this, they sort of distill 5 different areas or 5 different protective factors is what it's called in the research. And they call it internal assets, external resources, relationships and connections, family dynamics, and faith and spirituality. For the purposes of speaking to parents, I bring it down to these 5 things that relate back directly to those. And that is nurture, connections, relationships, family, and faith. And so I like to think of it like an umbrella. An umbrella is something that you have available, right? It's not something that you use every day, but it's something that you have purchased in advance, that you have ready. And when a storm hits, you're going to use that umbrella to protect you. So if we think about resilience and these protective factors in the same way, then we've got to have some of these things sort of in place to utilize when those storms come. So COVID-19 is definitely a storm, right? It's definitely changed everybody. And it's what we would call even a population-wide trauma, where everyone in the population that you're in is experiencing negative effects of it. And so we're going to sort of flesh out, how do we use each one of these, or how do we strengthen each one of these little umbrella panes in how we help kids. Now, the good news is that this concept works whatever the situation. Could be a death of a family member, could be a divorce, could be any sort of difficulty that a child has. But I'm going to dial in specifically to COVID-19. But I want you to know these principles sort of translate everywhere else. So the first one on that umbrella pane was nurture. And so the statement is to nurture your child. This has to do with the individual child. It has to do with who they are, their temperament, their personality, their ability to self-regulate, their ability to express their feelings, their ability to cognitively understand what's going on. It's sort of all those internal things. Remember, I used the word internal assets. So what are some things that you can do to strengthen that? Well, first of all, we always, anytime we're in a difficult time, we want to use our discretion and talk about events in age-appropriate ways. So we want to use appropriate language to describe what's going on in our world. I like to call this measured truth. And so just as when you have a child and they are needing to take medication, that pediatrician is going to get their height and weight chart out and their age, and they're going to look and see how much they weigh and how old they are, and that's going to determine how much medicine those kids are given. In the same way, when we talk about hard things, we're going to measure the truth according to what they can understand and who they are. And so we want to just use good age-appropriate language. Media exposure. We know that as adults, we are sort of dialed in and tuned into what are the experts saying, what's the press conference saying, what direction are we going. But kids need less of that because we know that repeated exposure to an event may create or increase anxiety and fear in kids. The best example, David, is whenever we had 9/11, we learned some things from this, in the sense that kids later told us that as that plane, flying into the Trade Center was played over and over and over again. You remember that? Like they played it over and over again. What kids tell us is that they thought it was happening over and over again because they weren't able to separate out on the TV what was happening today, what had happened yesterday, and et cetera. So kids don't always understand that. So we want to limit that media exposure, and for adults as well. Honestly, we need to limit that as well. Yes, sir.
Hey, quick question there on that. Does it, and this may be a silly question, but does it matter the age of the child? So let's say I've got preschoolers, but then I also have older elementary kids. Or should we be looking at them a little bit different? Or right now, pretty much all kids, we really kind of need to keep them separated from this conversation?
Well, I think in terms of viewing media stuff, I would say that all of us, even adults, need to limit that intake because I know that I can become a little anxious if I watch too much of it, right? And so I think everybody needs to limit their exposure, particularly with kids. Now, in terms of how do you talk to kids, I think that's definitely different with preschoolers and children. That you're gonna talk to them in different ways and provide different amount of information. The thing with older kids is they're online a lot, and their schooling is requiring that. So they're being exposed to more information anyway. So that requires us to help them filter that information. Okay. All right. So if your child is struggling with this, one of the ways that you can sort of bolster that pane of the umbrella is to remember times when your kids have navigated difficulties in the past. How did they react or respond to something difficult in the past? What helped them? And then be able to utilize that. We call that scaffolding in education, where we're kind of building concept upon concept upon concept. In the same way, we can help our kids deal with difficult things by reminding them of how they dealt with it in the past. It kind of bolsters their confidence to be able to say, this is hard, but remember when this happened and you were able to work through it, just like you were able to work through it there, we're going to work through this as well. And then the last one is just foster creativity and problem solving by giving kids time and space to play and imagine and develop their coping skills. I think that's one of the beauties of this particular time in our world, is that kids have been able to play and to imagine and to be creative. And I think that's one of the lost things in childhood, and that will help them. So make sure you leave room for simple joys of childhood. And we see a lot of that out on the internet. So that's the first one. The second one's a little quicker, won't take quite as long, but just to connect to your community. Researchers call that external resources, the things that you have outside of yourself. This would be your schools. We know that most kids who attend school, some don't attend schools, but most kids who do, that's a really important part of their life. And it's one of the most influential things. It could also be your neighborhood. It could be your sports team, whatever it might be in your community that provides support to your child. You want to stay connected to that. So you want to talk about efforts going on in your community to help people, point them to the positive things that are happening. You want to encourage kids to help, because kids and adults, really, we cope better and recover faster when we can help others. And so find simple ways for them to contribute. It might be making a card, sending a digital greeting, or helping collect food for a food bank. It could be a lot of different things, but our community can be an important part of the support that our kids have. Remember that they need to stay connected to their teachers at school, if they're in public school or private school, that's a really important source of support. And then just to emphasize hope and show the ways that needs are being met in the community. And so community is an important part. The third one is maintaining and valuing relationships. We know that the more kids are connected, the better they tend to fare in difficult times. If they can receive support from people, that's going to help them. And so how do we do that? Well, we are doing it a lot right now with social media and technology. And so that's a good thing. So allow your kids to use technology to stay connected with those important adults. I know that as our family, we've Zoomed with my parents who live in Oklahoma, and they don't want to expose themselves yet to us. And so we've found creative ways on Easter to Zoom with them. So all of us are learning to do new things, and that's one of them. Also, just to embrace the efforts of your schools and churches to maintain that strong presence in your community. Churches particularly, and David, I know y'all are doing some creative things too, but they are being so creative right now. And it's not that David doesn't have anything to do right now. It's that David understands how important it is to stay connected. Our kids need to stay connected, and our parents need to stay connected to the local church body. And so let your kids reciprocate in ways that are appropriate. Let them embrace and stay involved and engaged with whatever it is your local children's ministry is doing. Draw a picture, write a note, send a text. Find ways for them to maintain and value those relationships. And of course, it also means that as a family, we stay connected. It's hard, it's challenging right now to work for many of us and be a good parent and be a good homeschool teacher and be a cafeteria worker and be a laundry person. All those things, parents are juggling a lot of different hats. And so it's important at some point in time each day to connect with your kids. Which leads really to the next one, which has to do with family dynamics. We know that families and how they function sort of set the path in many ways for kids. As the parents go, many times so the kids go. And so as we think about leading our family, the first thing is just to be gentle with yourself. Give yourself grace. None of us, David, I know you're not old enough to have done this. None of us have parented through a pandemic. Like this is completely, it's completely new. And Dave, what is the greatest challenge for you? I'm curious, David, for you as a parent during this.
As a parent, I think, and this is something fairly new, Shelly, that we're kind of watching and seeing how it goes. But because we have an only child, there's just three of us here, and the social part of this has gone pretty well. I mean, trying to set up things, making sure that we're just doing our own thing. We happen to be where when I go to work, I can go to a separate place. Carrie Ann can do her school in a separate place, but maintaining this parental relationship, because it's weird, as a little bit weird, and I don't know, maybe some people don't have this same issue, but we're together so much that we're making decisions together, we're thinking about things together, that sometimes she becomes a little bit more than the child in this, but she still handles things as a child, and we're still trying to guide her through that. And sometimes it's hard for her to look in one direction and go, hey, I need to make sure I'm still allowing mommy and daddy to lead, and I'm not, because I mean, many times she's ahead of us on technology. She can do these things, and her schedule is just can be all out of whack, or it's just different. And so I think that dynamic of making sure that we're leading, and leading well, leading with that patience that you're talking about. I love that. Leading with the grace, but still guiding her through this process is probably one of the biggest personal challenges for us, and making sure that we can do that.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, and every family is going to be different. So a family with one child is going to be different than a family with 8 kids. I mean, I can't even imagine 8 kids trying to be on technology. I think that's one of the challenging things for us, is sometimes I have to say, okay, I need my computer. I need you to, go do this. And so it's interesting. But if you're struggling, and we know that many are, man, give yourself some grace and realize you're not alone. Sometimes social media, I think, makes it think like we all have it together. But this has pushed all of us sort of to our limits and outside of our comfort zone. And so give yourself buckets of grace to get through this. Also, monitor the content of your adult conversations, depending on how old your child is. Just remember they're listening, and remember they're very egocentric. And so they're going to think everything is about them. And so make sure that when you are talking, because we are all in very close proximity, that you don't create any fear. And I think this next slide really goes to what you just said, David, is that that kids, there's this art of parenting, and some days we get it right and some days we don't, right? But there's this art where we want to have rules and limits, and we want to be the ones in charge, right? But we also want to have warmth and unconditional love. And experts in parenting call that authoritative parenting, where there's lots of warmth but also limits. And so we need to remember that's what kids thrive best in. So sometimes in crisis, we relax the rules and the limits because maybe we feel bad or we feel sort of out of control of ourselves. And that's actually worse for kids when there's chaos. And so just maintain that. If your family tends to be more chaotic, then maybe work on getting more of a balance between love and rules. If your family is too rigid on the other end, kids are gonna rebel from that eventually as well. So finding that art, making sure that you keep a routine, right? That kids, predictability creates security for kids. And so the more predictability, the more security that kids feel. The last one that I want to spend a little bit of time on is just leaning into your faith. This is the 5th little umbrella pane, and I actually did my dissertation on this particular topic, and I was very interested that all researchers, whether they were faith type of people who believed in God or they had no interest in faith, all of them said kids with faith and spirituality tend to do better. We don't really understand why, but they just tend to do better. And so for us as Christians, we know why, because God gives us hope and we're able to persevere in difficult times. So we want to lean into our faith. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that. I like to show this little video. It's of Mr. Rogers, who's one of the great champions of children. He understood kids. And he has this video, maybe some of you have seen it, but it's called Look for the Helpers. It's about a 58-second video. I want to show it, and then I want to transition that into how we help kids look for God in the same way. So let's watch this.
You know, my mother used to say a long time ago, whenever there would be any really catastrophe that was in the movies or on the air, she would say, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers, you know, even just on the sidelines. That's why I think that if news programs could make a conscious effort of showing rescue teams, of showing medical people, anybody who is coming into a place where there's a tragedy, to be sure that they include that. Because if you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope.
So great words of wisdom from Mr. Rogers. I want to take that same concept of looking for helpers and say that we need to look for God in these moments, regardless of what it is. This particular time in our life, it's the COVID-19 virus. And so we want to help our kids look for God in this. There's lots of ways that we can see God at work. Churches are doing things. Nonprofit organizations like Samaritan's Purse are doing things. All kinds of people. Doctors are praying with patients. Nurses are praying with patients. All these different ways that we can see God at work. Maybe it's in the way that God provides food for our family. Maybe there's a need and the church meets it or somebody like that. But we want to recall and retell stories from the past of God's provision and protection for your family. It's similar to the Ebenezer stone story that we find in 1 Samuel 7, where the Israelites had just won a really big battle against the Philistines, and Samuel put an Ebenezer stone, which means so far or thus far God has helped us. And he wanted the people to always remember how God helped them during that time, so that when tough times came again, they could point back and remember it. It's a similar thing in our lives as Christians, is that we want to mark those times when God has helped us so that we can point back to them. And that gives us the hope and the perseverance to make it through the next thing. I think about David and Goliath. You know, he said, I can fight this Goliath because God's already helped me kill a lion and a bear, right? And so it's that same concept where we point back to God's faithfulness to give us courage to move on to the next thing. Psalm 78:4 talks about how we want to tell the next generation what God has done for us. So I love that idea. I hadn't thought of doing a whole wall of that. That's incredible. So we want to point that out and show kids that because they'll remember those things. So here's a couple of more things then with leaning into your faith. Be willing to talk through the hard questions that kids may have about God. Some kids, it's not going to elicit these kinds of things, but other kids are going to wonder, you know, why is this happening? I think about our older kids who are missing out on things that they had planned to do, graduations and proms and all that type of things. It's tough. Those are big, important moments that kids have. And so be willing to have those hard conversations. Highlight characters in the Bible who experienced God's comfort during difficult times. If you look at the faith chapter, just every character that's mentioned who is faithful had some really tough things happen to them. And so we can remind ourselves of Joseph and Job and Paul and all those different people that God allowed to go through some things, but God helped them. And then use Bible verses to instill hope and peace about the future. Lots of different verses. I think sometimes just letting kids pick the one that's most significant to them is a better route than imposing our own verse upon them. But I think about, for me, Psalms 56:3, what time I am afraid, I will trust in you. It kind of acknowledges that there's going to be some times when we're afraid. And I think I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't at times a little anxious or worried even now about things, because all of us would like our jobs and we all want to be able to provide for our families. And so there is some fear that we have to sort of work through. And so finding those verses that help, and then praying together daily. I think that's the thing that I miss the most with my little kindergarten Sunday school class is listening to them pray each week. This little girl, the picture on the screen here, is a great picture of just the sincerity and purity of a child's heart when they pray. And so allow them to do that and do that together daily. Go ahead.
Let me ask a quick question about the praying together, but also just when we talk about our own fears, and like you said, we all have them, we all processing them, and there may be opportunities for us to process with a spouse or another adult, maybe over a phone call or something like that. But where do we draw the line on processing those things with our kids? Because we don't want to create more fear in them.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, we also want them to see how the Lord is helping us through this and how we're trusting in Him and that. Right. So can you help me speak to maybe just specifically parents of elementary and younger kids?
Right. So first of all, we know that feelings are hard to express, right? So kids have a hard time putting into words. As a matter of fact, we do. Sometimes it takes me a lot of thought to figure out, what am I feeling actually? Is it frustration? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it grief? What is it? So kids have a hard time doing that. So they need models in their life to do that. They also need prompts to do that. So I think that for us, it comes in the form of some way in which we've already sort of dealt with it. Hey, you know what? I've had some fears too, but this is the verse that's helped me. Rather than, I'm fearful to them. But to kind of talk about those fears and then how those have been resolved. The other thing that is helpful is to use something like a feelings chart for kids. You can find those online. They have all these different feelings: sad, happy, mad, surprised, scared, all these different feelings. And you ask kids to point out what it is they're feeling that day so that they can begin to put words to their feelings. Having an emotional vocabulary is a very important skill, because if they don't have that emotional vocabulary, they do it and express it in their behavior. So biting, hitting, pushing, anger outbursts, those types of things are often at the root of that is their feelings that they're not able to express. So it is important. You do want to monitor how you do that and do it appropriately. And I think that's another one of those arts of parenting. But when you share that, you're being real, but you're also showing hope. So I think those two things have to sort of be connected. You got to be real, but you've also got to have hope and confidence. Does that answer that a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you. That's perfect.
Let's end with this slide right here, and then I'll give you another resource if you're interested. For some, I mentioned, David, some are really struggling. We know that counseling centers are being utilized more. We know that depression is, on the rise, that a lot of people have anxiety. And so we ask ourselves, if I have all those things, if I'm able to nurture my child, if we have good connections and good relationships and our family's sort of functioning at a high level, and we do have our faith and spirituality, then why is this still so hard? I sort of alluded to it in the beginning, but we're really what's called a population-wide trauma, meaning that every aspect of your life has been impacted by what's going on in our world. It's similar to Hurricane Katrina for our friends in Louisiana, or even 9/11, where literally everyone's impacted. And so where you might have drawn strength from school in the past, schools are offline more so. Where going to church was therapeutic and helpful, you're not able to actually go physically to church. Your family, trying to have working parents in the home and doing homeschool and managing the fears and anxiety about the crisis that we're in, and maybe being fearful about losing your job. is hit too. And so just like this umbrella here is laying on the ground, every area has been hit in some way. So that makes it trickier. That makes it a little harder for us to cope. And so we have to begin to sort of rebuild some of those things that are difficult. And that really relates back to all those suggestions I just gave you. Here's some ways to strengthen those things, but just to realize it's hard. It is really hard. And here's why: because everything in your life has sort of been turned upside down. Everyone is being required to be nimble and agile in different ways and have about 1,000 different hats that they're wearing. And so that goes back to that: give yourself some grace and realize that it's hard. It's a hard situation, and it's hopefully very temporary. Hopefully we're going to see some of this stuff begin to be lifted, and then we'll have other issues to deal with about how do we move kids back into that. But one of the things that I can do for you, you all, if you want it, is I have a resilience survey that parents fill out, and you answer about 30 really short answer type questions, and then you score it. It's pretty self-explanatory, and it'll show you which area of these are stronger than others and which areas are weaker than others. And so you could look and see, okay, looks like our family dynamics is a little bit weak, and then you could sort of try to do some things to help strengthen that. So I'll be happy to give that to you. The main thing with resilience literature is it's strength-based. In other words, you want to build on the strengths that you have. And so I hope that's helpful. Some people make the statement, kids are resilient, as though it's a given. The truth really is that kids can be resilient. Not all kids are going to be resilient. The truth is that some are going to kind of come out of this and you're going to wonder, did it impact them at all? And then some are going to come out of it and really struggle. And so we want to help those who are really struggling to know that there's hope and that there's some things that you can do. And, one of the most important things, I think, is in anticipation of future things that we'll likely deal with our kids at some point in time, we want to do everything we can to strengthen all those parts of the umbrella. And one of those that I think is going to reemerge as really important is the faith and spirituality component, that we really need to make sure that is just as important as everything else in our kids' lives. And so I hope that will happen. And I also hope that relationships will become more of a priority for our kids, because I think there's a deficit in that with kids. They're pushed and pulled in so many different directions that their relationships are not as strong as we want them to be. And so there's some things that we can do to work on it. But to answer the question, will my kids be okay? Well, here's some things that you can do to sort of help them be okay.
I really appreciate your time, Shelly. I thank you for spending time with us to do that, and just the practical sense of what you're talking about. As I think through this, are there one of those five or a couple of them that are harder than others? I think that's probably different for everybody. Some people just naturally, in our house, because we're in ministry, I think sometimes we talk about so much in ministry and talk about the Lord a lot because of different things, and that may become a little bit more natural for us. Whereas somebody who maybe is a new believer or something like that, it might be a little harder to jump into that conversation. And so we want to always encourage and give resources that'll help. One thing that I had a conversation with someone a couple weeks ago, and the basic idea was this, that no matter what, begin conversations. Just talk to your kids. Let them know you're interested in them. Find out what they are liking to do right now. And even if that's something that you just can't stand, you go and you get in there and try it, and spend time with them. Carrie Ann and I have started on this trek of riding bicycles every day. And she told me the other day as we're riding back in, she said, Daddy, what's your favorite time of the day? And I said, well, I like the morning. I like the evening. She said, no, not that kind of day. She said, I mean, on your schedule, what you do. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about that. What do you mean? And do we have a dog here? That's funny. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, my favorite time, or one of my favorite times, is this time right now. And it's just the going and riding bikes, And just being able, and as we ride, she tells me all about what she and mommy did today, and what she's thinking and what her ideas are. And I'm thankful that it's something that I also enjoy to get out and do too. But it doesn't take a whole lot of time. We ride about 3 miles and come back through our neighborhood. And she's now decided she's going to race at times. And it's just, we have some fun with it. And but doing things, whether that's baking together, or I love your idea about serving other people, and how can you get them and process that. Those are things that we're processing too. So anyway, thank you for today. I appreciate you investing so much time into us, and thank you for that resource. And I do look forward to being able to get that resource and share that out to our parents, moms and dads. What we'll do with this is I will probably tag this to the Facebook post when we put it out. And if there's a way for me to put it in the YouTube information under the video when it's actually published on YouTube, then I'll do that too, just to give you that resource. But Shelly, are there any other resources that you would point us to right now that we need to be doing? I know we're kind of overdone on online stuff, but I still think that there are good resources out there for parents. And is there anything, even if there's not, it's okay, but even if there is, do you have something that you would recommend?
Right off the top of my head, I think finding ways to leverage influence with you. So whatever curriculum you're using or whatever study you're on, if parents can tag into that, I'm sure that y'all are providing links to take-home pages and information about what they're doing. But I think sometimes we miss the synergy that can happen between the church and the home by not maintaining that strong connection. I think this crisis has kind of forced us to be reintroduced to all of those things in a very positive way. And so I would suggest sort of partnering more with you guys. I think that's the simplest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really good, it's a really good suggestion that we try to put the things together that we and use and partner together. That's what we do when we're normal. We're trying to partner together, and moms and dads, no matter if you're listening to this from here at First Baptist Indian Trail, or the Lift ministry that we have here, or maybe you're somewhere else, but I know your church is putting things together and trying to stay connected with you. So please use those things that they put out, and be able to use, if nothing more, then just use them as conversation starters around the dinner table. We found that's really a good place to talk and chat and just begin what can maybe turn into some family worship times. Just all kinds of different ideas kind of come out of at the dinner table, and let your child do talking. Don't ask just a lot of yes or no questions. Let them expand on what they're thinking, because you learn a lot from that. Well, Shelly, thank you so much again. And moms and dads, we're going to wrap up this time with our first Family Today conversations. I really appreciate the time with Dr. Shelly Melia from Dallas Baptist University, and just her influence on my life, and I know on countless others. And so I just thank you for that time. And we ask you to tune back in next time, and we'll have another one of our guests talking to us, helping us know exactly how do we bring hope to our home. Thank you again for joining us.